What happened when the millionaire saw his pregnant ex-wife working as a waitress at his wedding? The air froze, and time seemed to stop. He stood there in his tailored tuxedo, gripping the champagne flute so tightly that it almost cracked under the pressure of his fingers. His heart pounded like a drum against his chest, each beat echoing louder than the soft jazz playing in the background. She was just a few feet away from him, balancing a tray laden with hors d'oeuvres, her swollen belly hidden beneath an oversized apron. Her face, still familiar yet painfully distant, was etched with exhaustion but also determination. The room buzzed around them, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. Friends, family, business associates, all gathered here for what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. But now, all he could see was her, the woman who had once been his everything, reduced to serving canapés at the celebration of his new beginning. How did it come to this? Why hadn't anyone told him she was struggling? His mind raced back to their last conversation years ago, filled with bitter words and broken promises. And now, here they were again, fate forcing them into a collision neither could have predicted. As guests mingled and laughed nearby, unaware of the emotional turmoil unfolding before them, he felt something stir deep within, a mix of guilt, regret, and maybe even hope. This wasn't how today was supposed to go. Today was meant to mark a fresh start, not reopen old wounds. Yet, as he watched her move gracefully through the crowd, her eyes avoiding his at every turn, he knew one thing for certain: whatever happened next would change everything, for both of them. The grand ballroom shimmered under crystal chandeliers, casting golden light over tables adorned with white roses and gold accents. It was the kind of venue people dreamed about for their big day, a place where fairy tales came true. But tonight, the opulence felt suffocating to Daniel Harper, the groom everyone assumed had it all. At 34, he was the CEO of a tech empire worth billions, known for his sharp mind and even sharper suits. To the outside world, he was untouchable, invincible. But beneath the polished exterior lay cracks no one dared to notice. Daniel's journey to success hadn't been easy. Raised by a single mother in a small town, he'd grown up watching her work 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. Those early years taught him resilience, grit, and the value of hard work. By the time he turned 25, he'd already launched his first startup, pouring every ounce of energy into making it succeed. And succeed it did, catapulting him into a life of luxury he never imagined possible. Along the way, he met Emily Carter, a bright-eyed artist whose laughter lit up even his darkest days. For a while, they were unstoppable, a perfect blend of ambition and creativity. They dreamed of building a future together, one filled with love, art, and adventure. But dreams have a way of unraveling when reality sets in. As Daniel's career skyrocketed, Emily found herself increasingly sidelined. Late-night meetings replaced date nights, and missed calls became more frequent than heartfelt conversations. Their fights grew louder, their silences heavier. Eventually, the breaking point came, a tearful argument that ended with Emily walking out, leaving behind only a note that read, "I can't compete with your empire." That was 3 years ago, and Daniel hadn't seen or heard from her since. Now, standing in the middle of his own wedding reception, Daniel couldn't shake the irony of the situation. Here he was, surrounded by wealth and privilege, marrying someone else entirely, a woman named Claire who represented stability and order. She was beautiful, intelligent, and shared his vision for the future. Or at least, that's what he told himself. Deep down, though, he wondered if he was simply trying to fill a void left by Emily's absence. Across the room, Emily moved quietly among the guests, careful not to draw attention to herself. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the strap of her uniform, wishing she could disappear into thin air. Working as a waitress at this event had seemed like a harmless gig, a chance to earn some extra cash during a difficult time. What she hadn't anticipated was seeing him again. Not like this. Not when her entire world revolved around the tiny life growing inside her. A life that carried pieces of both their pasts. Her thoughts drifted back to the months after their breakup, when survival became her sole focus. Art commissions dried up, rent payments piled up, and pride kept her from reaching out to Daniel for help. So she took whatever job she could find, determined to make ends meet on her own terms. When she discovered she was pregnant, panic set in, but so did resolve. This baby would grow up knowing love, no matter what sacrifices she had to make. Even if it meant swallowing her pride and taking shifts at events like this one. Unbeknownst to either of them, their paths crossing tonight wasn't mere coincidence. It was destiny nudging them toward reckoning, with themselves, with each other, and with the choices that had brought them here. The ballroom buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses, but for Daniel, the noise faded into a distant hum. His eyes were fixed on Emily as she weaved through the crowd, her movements careful yet strained. Every step she took seemed heavier than the last, and he couldn't help but notice how she avoided looking in his direction. It was as if she were trying to make herself invisible, but to him, she stood out more than anyone else in the room. He wanted to call out to her, to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat. What could he possibly say? "I'm sorry. Why didn't you tell me? Or worse, how did we end up here?" His mind raced back to the last time they spoke. That night had been filled with tears and accusations, both of them too stubborn to listen, too hurt to see clearly. She'd accused him of choosing his career over her, while he'd argued that she didn't understand the sacrifices he was making for their future. In hindsight, maybe they were both right, and both wrong. But now, standing in this glittering hall, those arguments felt hollow compared to the weight of seeing her like this. Pregnant. Alone. Struggling. Emily paused by a table to refill someone's drink, her hands trembling slightly as she held the pitcher. A man sitting nearby gave her an impatient look, tapping his glass to hurry her along. She forced a polite smile, nodding quickly before moving on. Daniel clenched his jaw, anger bubbling inside him, not at her, but at himself. How had he let things get this far? Why hadn't he checked in on her after they parted ways? Was he really so consumed by his own life that he'd completely forgotten about hers? Claire, his fiancée, appeared beside him, looping her arm through his. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice light and cheerful, unaware of the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. He glanced at her, taking in her elegant gown and radiant smile. She deserved better than this, better than a man whose heart still carried pieces of another woman. "I need some air," he muttered, pulling away gently. Claire frowned, concern flickering across her face, but before she could respond, he was already walking toward the exit. The cool evening breeze hit him as soon as he stepped outside, offering a brief reprieve from the suffocating atmosphere inside. He leaned against the railing of the balcony, staring out at the city skyline. Lights twinkled in the distance, a stark contrast to the darkness clouding his thoughts. Back inside, Emily felt the tension mounting with each passing minute. She'd hoped blending into the background would be easy, but every glance from Daniel sent a jolt of panic through her. Part of her wanted to run, to leave this place and never look back, but pride kept her rooted to the spot. This job paid well, and she needed every penny. Besides, running had never solved anything, had it? Still, the thought of facing him again made her stomach churn. What must he think of her now? Did he pity her? Judge her? Or worse, feel nothing at all? As the night wore on, the guests grew louder, their laughter ringing in her ears like a cruel reminder of everything she'd lost. One couple near the bar caught her attention, a young man whispering sweet nothings into his partner's ear, their faces glowing with love and excitement. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what might have been. If only things had turned out differently. If only. Her musings were interrupted when a familiar voice called her name. Startled, she turned to see Daniel standing there, his expression unreadable. Her breath hitched, and for a second she considered pretending not to hear him. But then he took a step closer, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that left no room for escape. "We need to talk," he said simply, his tone firm yet tinged with vulnerability. His words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Emily hesitated, torn between the urge to flee and the nagging curiosity of what he might say. Finally, she nodded, setting down her tray and following him to a quieter corner of the venue. Away from the noise and prying eyes, they faced each other, the silence stretching taut like a wire ready to snap. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, visibly struggling to find the right words. "Emily," he began, his voice softer now, "why didn't you tell me?" Her defenses shot up immediately. "Tell you what?" she shot back, crossing her arms over her chest. "That I was working 2 jobs just to survive? That I got pregnant and didn't know how to ask for help? You made it pretty clear 3 years ago that my problems weren't your responsibility anymore." He flinched at her words, guilt washing over him like a tidal wave. "That's not fair," he replied, though even he could hear the lack of conviction in his voice. "You're right. I should have been there. I should have done more. But seeing you tonight," he trailed off, shaking his head, "it's tearing me apart." For a moment, Emily didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Here he was, the man who once promised her the world, reduced to stammering apologies in a dimly lit hallway. And yet, despite everything, she couldn't deny the sincerity in his eyes. Maybe it was foolish, but part of her wanted to believe him, to give him another chance. Before she could respond, a commotion erupted from the main hall, a loud crash followed by gasps and murmurs. Both of them instinctively turned toward the sound, their private moment shattered by the chaos unfolding beyond the doors. Whatever happened next, Daniel realized, would change everything, for both of them. Daniel and Emily exchanged a glance, their private tension momentarily forgotten as the noise from the ballroom grew louder. Without thinking, they both moved toward the source of the commotion, drawn by instinct. Pushing through the heavy double doors, they were met with a scene that stopped them in their tracks. A waiter had tripped, sending an entire tray of champagne glasses crashing to the floor. The sound was deafening, shards of glass glittering like ice under the chandelier lights. But it wasn't the mess that held everyone's attention. It was Claire. She stood at the center of the room, her face pale but composed, holding up a hand to silence the murmurs spreading among the guests. Her eyes scanned the crowd, landing briefly on Daniel before shifting to Emily. For a split second, something flickered across her expression. Was it hurt? Anger? Or maybe understanding? Whatever it was, it sent a chill down Daniel's spine. "Everyone, please," Claire said, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "There's no need for alarm. Accidents happen." She offered a tight smile, trying to diffuse the awkwardness, but the damage was already done. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with unspoken questions. Had she seen Daniel and Emily together? Did she know? Emily took a step back, suddenly feeling out of place. This wasn't her world anymore, if it ever had been. She didn't belong here, surrounded by these people who whispered behind closed hands and judged silently. Yet, as much as she wanted to slip away unnoticed, Daniel's presence anchored her. His gaze kept finding hers, searching for answers she wasn't sure she could give. Claire approached them then, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Up close, Daniel could see the cracks in her composure, the slight quiver in her jaw, the way her fingers tightened around the stem of her wineglass. "Can we talk?" she asked, her tone calm but laced with urgency. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. Daniel hesitated, glancing between the two women in his life. Emily looked away first, her shoulders stiffening as if bracing for impact. "Go ahead," she muttered softly, almost too low for him to hear. "This isn't my business anyway." Her words stung more than he cared to admit. He opened his mouth to respond, but Claire interrupted, pulling him aside before he could say anything. They retreated to a secluded corner near the bar, far enough from prying ears, but still within view of the rest of the room. Emily watched them go, her chest tightening with a mix of emotions she couldn't untangle. Was it jealousy, resentment, or simply sadness for what might have been? "You owe me an explanation," Claire said once they were alone, her voice dropping to a whisper. Her eyes bore into his, demanding honesty. "Who is she?" Daniel sighed, running a hand over his face. There was no point in lying. Not now, not after everything. "Her name is Emily," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "We used to be together before you." Claire's lips pressed into a thin line, her grip on the wineglass tightening until her knuckles turned white. "And she's pregnant," she stated flatly, her tone betraying none of the turmoil swirling inside her. "Is it yours?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He hadn't even considered that possibility until now. Could it be true? Had Emily carried his child all this time without telling him? The thought made his head spin, guilt and hope warring within him. "I don't know," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I need to find out." Claire let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're unbelievable. You know that? We're supposed to be getting married tomorrow, and instead you're chasing after your ex-wife, or whatever she is, like some lovesick teenager." Her voice rose slightly, drawing curious glances from nearby guests. She lowered it again, leaning closer so only he could hear. "What do you want, Daniel? Her or me?" He didn't answer right away. How could he, when he wasn't even sure himself? All he knew was that seeing Emily tonight had awakened something deep inside him, something he'd buried long ago. Memories of late-night conversations, shared dreams, and quiet moments flooded back, overwhelming him with a longing he hadn't realized he still carried. But at the same time, he cared about Claire. She deserved better than this, better than a man whose heart was torn in two. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. "I never meant to hurt you. You've been amazing, and He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. What could he say that wouldn't make things worse? Claire studied him for a long moment, her expression softening ever so slightly. Then, without another word, she set the wineglass down on a nearby table and walked away. Daniel watched her go, guilt weighing heavily on his shoulders. He wanted to chase after her, to explain, to fix this somehow, but his feet remained rooted to the spot. Instead, his eyes drifted back to Emily, who stood near the entrance, watching him with a mixture of fear and resignation. Taking a deep breath, he made his decision. Crossing the room, he stopped in front of her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Emily," he began, his voice trembling with emotion, "we need to figure this out. Together." For a moment, she just stared at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "Why now? After all this time, why does it matter to you?" "It matters because it's you," he replied, his words spilling out faster than he could control them. "Because I never stopped caring, no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise. Because—" he paused, swallowing hard. "Because I think we owe it to ourselves, and to whoever that baby is, to at least try. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, threatening to spill over. She wanted to believe him, to trust that this wasn't just guilt talking. But trusting Daniel again felt like stepping onto thin ice, unsure of whether it would hold or shatter beneath her weight. Still, there was something in his eyes, a raw vulnerability she hadn't seen in years, that gave her pause. "Okay," she whispered finally, nodding slowly. "But this doesn't mean we're okay." "Not yet." Daniel nodded, relief washing over him despite the uncertainty ahead. "I understand. One step at a time." As they stood there, the chaos of the ballroom fading into the background, neither of them noticed Claire watching from afar. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet strength in the way she held herself. Turning on her heel, she disappeared into the night, leaving behind the life she'd planned, and the man she'd loved. The cool night air wrapped around Emily as she stepped outside, Daniel following close behind. The sounds of the ballroom faded into the distance, replaced by the gentle hum of crickets and the distant glow of city lights. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything unsaid hanging heavy between them. Emily hugged herself tightly, partly to ward off the chill but mostly to keep her emotions in check. She didn't trust herself to look at him. Not yet. Not when his presence alone was enough to unravel years of carefully built walls. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, his voice low and steady, though it carried the faintest tremor of vulnerability. "But I need you to know that I'm not here because I feel guilty or obligated. I'm here because seeing you tonight reminded me of what I lost, of who I lost." Emily turned to face him then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You gave up on us, Daniel," she replied, her voice cracking under the weight of old pain. "You chose your empire over me, over us. And now you want to act like none of that matters." "It does matter," he shot back, his frustration spilling over. "Every single day since you left, I've thought about what I could have done differently, about how I failed you. But running away didn't solve anything either, did it? Look where we are now." His words hit her like a punch to the gut, forcing her to confront the truth she'd been avoiding for years. He was right. She had run. She'd convinced herself that disappearing was easier than fighting for what they once had. But standing here now, staring into his eyes, she realized that running hadn't healed her wounds. It had only buried them deeper. "I didn't know what else to do," she admitted softly, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "You were gone all the time, chasing deals and deadlines while I was left wondering if you even cared anymore. When I found out I was pregnant," her voice trailed off, choked by emotion, "I didn't think you'd want to hear from me. I didn't think you'd care." Daniel's heart sank, guilt pressing down on him like a leaden weight. "That's my fault," he said quietly, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I should have been there. I should have made time for you, for us. Instead, I let my ambition blind me to what really mattered." He took a step closer, his hand reaching out hesitantly before falling back to his side. "But I'm here now, Emily, and I want to make things right. If you'll let me." She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. What she saw wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was real, raw, human. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. Not as the people they used to be, but as the people they were now. "Okay," she whispered finally, her voice trembling but resolute. "We'll figure this out. Together. But it won't be easy, Daniel. You can't just walk back into my life and expect everything to fall into place." "I wouldn't dream of it," he replied, a small, hopeful smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. One step at a time, remember? They stood there for a while longer, the tension between them slowly easing into something softer, more fragile. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. As they walked back toward the venue, side by side but still worlds apart, Emily felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. Hope that maybe, after everything they'd been through, they could build something new. Something stronger. Inside, the ballroom had quieted down, most of the guests having moved on to dessert or retreated to the outdoor terrace. Claire was nowhere to be seen, her absence casting a shadow over the evening. Daniel hesitated near the entrance, torn between going after her and staying with Emily. Sensing his conflict, Emily placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Go," she said simply, her tone soft but firm. "Talk to her. She deserves closure, Daniel. We both do." He nodded, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you," he murmured before turning to leave. Watching him go, Emily felt a pang of sadness, but also a strange sense of relief. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning, a messy, uncertain one, but a beginning nonetheless. As Daniel searched for Claire, he found her sitting alone on a bench overlooking the garden, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She didn't look up as he approached, but she must have sensed his presence because she spoke before he could say anything. "You love her, don't you?" she asked, her voice devoid of anger or bitterness. "Just resignation." "I don't know," he admitted honestly, sitting down beside her. "All I know is that I can't ignore what I feel for her, or for the baby. But that doesn't mean I don't care about you, Claire. You've been incredible, and I'll always be grateful for everything you've given me." Claire let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Gratitude isn't love, Daniel, and I deserve someone who loves me completely, not halfway." She looked at him then, her eyes filled with a quiet strength that took him aback. "You're a good man, Daniel. Don't waste that on guilt or obligation. Go be the person you're meant to be." Her words struck a chord deep within him, filling him with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. He reached out to take her hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for understanding, for being you." When he returned to Emily later that night, he found her waiting by the fountain, her silhouette illuminated by the soft glow of string lights. She smiled when she saw him, a tentative but genuine expression that warmed his heart. Without saying a word, he joined her, their hands finding each other instinctively. Neither of them knew what the future held, but for the first time in years they felt ready to face it, together. The days that followed were a blur of emotions, conversations, and decisions neither Daniel nor Emily had anticipated. They started meeting in quiet places, small cafes with mismatched chairs, park benches under the shade of ancient oak trees, even the occasional late-night phone call when sleep eluded them both. Each interaction was a step toward understanding, though progress came in fits and starts. There were moments of laughter, flashes of the connection they once shared, but also silences heavy with unspoken fears and doubts. One evening, as they sat together on a pier overlooking a calm lake, Emily finally asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. "What happens next?" she said softly, skipping a pebble across the water's surface. Her voice carried a vulnerability she rarely showed, and it made Daniel pause. "I don't know," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the ripples spreading outward. "But I want to figure it out. With you. No shortcuts this time. No running away." She nodded slowly, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden planks beneath them. "It's scary, isn't it? Starting over like this." "It is," he agreed, turning to look at her. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe being scared means we're doing something right for once." His words lingered between them, simple yet profound. For so long they'd avoided fear, burying it under ambition, pride, or denial. But now, sitting side by side, they realized that facing it head-on might be the only way forward. It wasn't just about rebuilding their relationship. It was about rediscovering themselves along the way. As weeks turned into months, Daniel began making changes, not just in his personal life, but in how he approached his work. He hired a team to handle day-to-day operations, allowing him to carve out time for what truly mattered. He attended parenting classes with Emily, learning about childbirth, baby care, and the challenges ahead. At first, it felt awkward, almost surreal, but gradually, they found a rhythm, a fragile but hopeful balance. Their families noticed the shift too. Daniel's mother, who had always adored Emily, welcomed her back with open arms, tears streaming down her face during one particularly emotional dinner. Even Emily's younger brother, who had never warmed to Daniel before, seemed willing to give him another chance. The support meant more than either of them could put into words, grounding them during moments of doubt. But not everyone understood. Some of Daniel's business associates raised eyebrows at his sudden change in priorities, questioning whether he was losing focus. Claire, though absent from their lives now, remained a shadow in the background, a reminder of the life he'd walked away from. Still, Daniel didn't waver. Every glance at Emily's growing belly reinforced his decision. This wasn't just about fixing past mistakes. It was about creating something new, something meaningful. When the baby arrived, a tiny girl with Emily's nose and Daniel's stubborn chin, their world shifted again. Sleepless nights became a shared ritual, filled with whispered conversations and stolen glances over the crib. They argued sometimes, of course, about feeding schedules, diaper changes, and whose turn it was to get up at 3 a.m., but those disagreements only strengthened their bond. They were learning to navigate parenthood together, flaws and all. One afternoon, as they strolled through the park with the baby nestled snugly in a stroller, Emily stopped suddenly, pulling Daniel aside. "Do you ever wonder if we're doing enough?" she asked, her brow furrowed with worry. "If we're breaking some kind of cosmic rule by trying to fix things after everything that went wrong?" Daniel chuckled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Probably," he teased, earning a playful nudge from her. Then his expression softened. "But I think we owe it to ourselves, and to her, to try. Life doesn't come with guarantees, Em. All we can do is show up, be present, and hope that's enough." Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time they weren't born of sadness. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder as the baby cooed softly in the stroller. In that moment, surrounded by the hum of everyday life, they felt whole. Imperfect, yes, but whole. Years later, when their daughter was old enough to ask questions, they told her the story of how they came to be a family. Not the polished version, but the messy, honest truth. The heartbreak, the choices, the second chances. And as she listened, wide-eyed and curious, they realized something important. Love isn't about perfection. It's about effort. About showing up, even when it's hard. About choosing each other, over and over again. That realization stayed with them, shaping the way they lived their lives. They weren't the same people they'd been before. They were better, stronger, kinder. Together, they proved that redemption isn't just possible. It's worth fighting for.